But first, Prime Ministers do have to travel, and I'd be the first in the media to acknowledge this, given I worked for one. But I also know what the demands of the job are when you're not walking the diplomatic red carpet, and that's my worry. Because the more I look at this Prime Minister, the more I see what's not getting done, what's being missed, what's being stuffed up as well. And it's hard to avoid the conclusion that Anthony Albanese would prefer to be on a plane than behind a desk. Worse than that, he's a once-over-lightly politician that just isn't doing the work needed to get across the detail and get things done that matter to everyday Australians. Tonight, the PM's in San Francisco, shaking hands with Joe Biden and Xi Jinping, two leaders he's already seen in the past couple of weeks. In fact, this is his 21st international trip in scarcely a year and a half. I mean, that is Rudd-esque and not in a good way. Meanwhile, Australia's cost of living crisis deepens, and we've got a whole lot of senior Labor ministers who seem confused about whether we're facing an outbreak of anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. Even though it's a new Holocaust that tens of thousands of people are marching in the street demanding Jews out of Israel, saying that Israel should be wiped out, with their cries of "from the river to the sea." But today it's all got worse, because the debacle over the handling of release into the community of some 84 foreign criminals exposes how clueless and indeed incompetent this Labor government really is. Yesterday, the Home Affairs Minister claimed that you can't out-legislate the High Court.
The idea that it is open to the Australian government to simply legislate away a High Court decision is not how our Constitution works.
Yet today, that minister introduced legislation to do just that. Although how much good it'll do is far from clear. And here's why. First up, the bill is about as rushed as I've ever seen. Now, I'd bet London to a brick they only issued drafting instructions in the last 24 hours. It needs urgent amendments if it's going to have any teeth at all. Indeed, that's what the opposition tried to do this morning in the House of Representatives, but Labor rejected their amendments to toughen up these draft laws. It then passed the House anyway because the government's got the numbers. But by question time, the acting PM, Richard Marles, well, he had rolled over, saying Labor would now work with the coalition in the Senate to make the legislation as good as it could be.
This morning, we introduced into the Parliament the Migration Amendment Bridging Visa Conditions Bill of 2023. Since then, we have been working cooperatively with the opposition around amendments to this piece of legislation.
Now, despite that cooperation that the acting PM says he's got, despite that, there is a problem. Even with this legislation, not one of the 84 criminals, foreign criminals, out in the community right now will be locked up. Not one. Now, worse than that, we also find out today there's another 340 of them that could still be released. On this point, here is Peter Dutton in the House today.
The Prime Minister has taken a decision not to re-detain these 84 serious criminals. This morning at 7:15, we get the hapless Immigration Minister and the hopeless Minister for Home Affairs in there, who moves from one disaster to the next, comes in there and says, here's the bill. They throw the bill onto the table and say, here's the bill. Will you support it? We want your bipartisan support. We said, well, there are countless provisions in this bill and we want more than an hour and a quarter to be able to look at it, to take legal advice and to decide our position. Because we think, even on the first quick read of it, it is completely and totally inadequate. Not just are we talking about the 84 out now and the 8 about to be released, we're now talking about a pipeline of 340 people. And potentially more beyond that. Potentially more beyond that.
340. And in question time, the opposition pushed the government again and again on this point. What are you doing, they asked, to try and keep the 340-odd locked up in detention?
Will the acting Prime Minister commit the government to passing preventative detention legislation to stop the 340 hardened criminals from being released?
And then this fence-sitting twaddle from the acting Prime Minister.
We do nothing to promote community safety by taking steps in this place which will not survive legal challenge. And that's to state the most obvious fact.
No answer, just a whole lot of blah, blah, blah. Now, I know how this works, and this is where the government's let Australians down, and they are not telling you the truth. They want to try and blame this on the High Court, that they were somehow caught off guard by the court's decision last Wednesday. Now, that is utter rubbish. The Immigration Minister and the Home Affairs Minister, quite possibly to the Attorney General, they would all have got a brief from their departmental officials getting clearance from the ministers for the defence that was then run by the Commonwealth in this High Court case. So the briefs would have been on desks months and months and months ago. And in those briefs, or one that would have come immediately after the initial one, there would have been advice as to what would happen if they won the case and what would happen if they lost it. There would then have been talk about a plan B. You're going to lose it, Minister. If you lose it, here's our plan B. And they would have all then sat down and talked about actioning a plan B if they were doing their jobs properly. As Peter Dutton again admitted this morning, now he's a former Home Affairs Minister himself, the government knew months ago that on this issue they were in trouble.
They were told by the High Court in June that the High Court had changed its mind or had problems. They should have been drafting legislation from then. And again, we couldn't get a straight answer on that this morning.
So here we are. As I said, even with this legislation, these foreign criminals will stay on the streets because the government isn't willing to go in as hard as it should. These foreign criminals will all still be eligible for welfare and rent assistance and travel assistance, even $10,000 worth of support to help them set up a home. And what, you want to know, what do their victims get?
One of the hardcore criminals who's been released into the Australian community is Mohammed Rafiq, who has been convicted of both rape and sexual assault. On hearing of him being released into the Brisbane community, his victim said that she started crying immediately and felt a numbness. Has the Minister or his department contacted this victim to provide her with any reassurance, assistance or support?
And now listen to the weak response from Immigration Minister Andrew Giles.
I can't comment on individual cases. The Department of Home Affairs is and has been engaging closely with state and territory enforcement agencies and proactively sharing information. It's also incumbent on our state and territory law enforcement agencies to enforce existing state and territory requirements.
And seriously, get your head out of your notes, mate. I mean, this is huge, and you're not across the detail. Peter Dutton quite rightly says not good enough. Let's not forget too, he's a former police detective before he entered the Parliament.
Can the Acting Prime Minister give an assurance that the government will make contact with each of the victims of these 84 individuals, and in the cases where the victim is deceased, the victim's family?
I mean, the point surely is not to have foreign criminals resident in Australia, regardless of how many times they have to report to police or might wear these ankle bracelets, which I might add are not even mandatory. They're at the discretion of that minister. Or even if Labor does nothing, it should at least make sure the victims are notified. But it gets worse. We learned today that in addition to welfare, these foreign criminals can be paid hundreds of thousands of dollars each in compensation for their indefinite detention. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars each after they abused Australia and our hospitality, after they were found not to be refugees, after they refused to go home, or the countries they came from refused to take them back. But as bad as all of that is, the biggest issue here, because governments all have to deal with thorny problems, often thorny problems all at the one time, is that this government is starting to look increasingly clueless and incompetent. Now, a Prime Minister is a bit like a conductor of an orchestra. It goes well enough if all the musicians can play their instruments and the conductor out the front knows the score. But if that's not the case, it's a whole lot of amateurs thrashing about. And that's where the government is at now. No one has got the music in front of them. Most of them can't even play a tune. And the conductor, well, he's away from the podium and out of the room most of the time. Out more times than he's in the room. No wonder there's such a cacophony. And this is a Prime Minister who's too often missing in action, leading a government that's divided between a handful of pragmatists and a majority of hard left, green left ideologues. And with over now 80 hardened criminals on the street, more yet likely to be released and paid millions in compensation too, I tell ya, Australians are the real losers.